Okay, let's kick this off with an anecdote. Let's move from the particular to the general and not vice versa. Um, I had a friend, or I guess I might say a colleague in university, and he was a psychology major. He came into class one day. It was a TA session, so I think there was one PhD student as the instructor and maybe 10 students. So it's a small classroom. It's not like a big theater classroom. And the teacher began this university class by asking each of the students if they had done the assigned reading before the class. And every single one of them admitted that no, they had not done the assigned reading. And the teacher then admitted that he himself also had not done any of the assigned reading. Several of the students then suggested that they end the class and just go home early. And the TA said that no, he didn't think that would be appropriate. He thought that they should nevertheless spend a class together, given, I guess, that's what he was paid to do. So he proposed a topic for conversation that didn't require any reading. He proposed that they discuss what are their greatest fears, psychology being, after all, the subject. This is a 400 level advanced psychology class. And then I think four of the students insisted that spiders were the scariest thing in the world. And the teacher spent his time trying to insist to them that no, being stabbed or drowned was much scarier. And they insisted back that no, really, they considered spiders the scariest thing. Now, the guy who told me this anecdote, he told it to me in the sort of harried, shell-shocked, unreflecting way of someone who just come out of this situation. He wasn't, I'm just certain he was telling me the absolute truth. He was telling me the very literal truth. You could tell it was one of the situations where he just kind of walked out of the situation and was utterly exasperated with it and hadn't kind of made up his mind. He hadn't constructed it into a charming anecdote or what have you. And, I felt very keenly the same type of exasperation and, disappointment time and time again in Western academia. And, it's partly a sense of shock and disbelief. How is it possible that in this setting, which may have, wood panel on the walls, may have, ivy growing on the stone walls, literally. My university did in places. University of Toronto, they had some ivy growing on stone. You have these pretensions, and you have this tremendous cost. You're paying thousands of dollars, and you have this brief opportunity in your life to get an education. How could it possibly be that the type of conversation you're having is at such a low level that it can be compared to schoolyard banter? Like, not even high school, grade school, the intellectual discussions among children. How is it possible that a university instructor or professor is so shamelessly lacking preparation, has not done the reading, and so on? I had professors admit to me openly that they had not read the book that the course was based on. In one case, it was supposed to be about philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, and the professor assigned to the course admitted he had never read Schopenhauer on day one of the class. And I did write and send in a complaint about it, but it was a ridiculous situation. There's a lot more I could tell that story. There was another course that was supposed to be about Thomas Hobbes and exactly the period of the English Civil War. And the woman, the professor who was teaching the class, and I was later told, I mentioned she was a woman because in this case I was told, as a matter of fact, by other professors that she was given the job because of who she was sleeping with. She was sleeping with another professor. The woman who was assigned the class did not know the name Oliver Cromwell. She didn't know the name of the person who is as important to that period of history as Napoleon is to the Napoleonic era or what have you. He's the single most important. And it was very obvious to me. So she admitted that. She admitted she'd never heard of Oliver Cromwell. She did not admit to me that she had actually never read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, but it seemed to me quite obvious that she had not. And it's shameless. I mean, the low standards that go on in the classroom. Now, I've not been here using really, I haven't been using the type of examples that scandals are made of. There's plenty of that goes on also in the university. The reason why I mention these peculiar, funny little examples, and many of you watching this will know hundreds more. I've also read examples that ended up in court and thus ended up in the newspapers of professorial incompetence and in conduct and poor conduct. this culture of impunity will end precisely when the possibility of scrutiny is introduced into it. I mentioned this concept of scrutiny many times in the earlier video, and I pointed that peer review is not a system of scrutiny. It's just a system of censorship. Now, students are capable of scrutinizing their professors. What they're not capable of, by and large, is scrutinizing them on the spot, instantly, and standing up with self-confidence and challenging the professor right then. And of course, if they do, they may be punished. They may get a lower grade. They may have opportunities taken away from them. So what the internet opens up, and especially with internet video, is the possibility of the student recording the video, doing fact-checking later, and then sharing this, quite possibly anonymously. It creates the dynamic possibility of real scrutiny, so that students can scrutinize the professor, so that other professors can scrutinize the conduct of the professor, and so on. And suddenly, facts matter. Now, it's very sad that the professors in the current generation are so utterly lacking in an ethic of education, frankly. I was going to say of educational responsibility, of feeling this responsibility towards their students. When I was going through university, the most elderly professors, they still did have that ethic. And I could see that there were both advantages and disadvantages towards their attitude. So the really, really elderly professors sometimes felt that, they knew the interpretation of Plato, and they had to share with the next generation, they had to share with you, the student, or the students, plural, the correct interpretation of Plato. And of course, this makes the course into a railroad track. There's one point of departure, there's one conclusion. The course is going to move on a straight line, and there's no possibility of the student having their own interpretation or frankly original thought that would be valued in the classroom. The next generation coming after them, I think they very broadly wanted to challenge that paradigm. They believed that all of these texts were open to an infinite number of equally valid interpretations, and that the creativity of the student should be valued in the classroom and in essay writing. However, that belief became a pretext for them to frankly shirk all of the responsibilities a professor might have. And I think they're sort of conscious of one side of the coin and utterly unconscious of the other. I might say mindful of one side of that equation, and they're not mindful at all about the other. So the same justification that lets the professor say, well, all I need to do is present you young adults with this text, and you'll make up your own minds, sort of does in this strange way lead to the attitude that, oh well, it doesn't really matter if the professor hasn't thoroughly prepared their own notes and their own lecture. It doesn't matter if the professor hasn't actually familiarized himself with the status of women in Confucianism or what actually happened in the English Civil War, even though the course generally, and today's lecture particularly, is about exactly this topic. If it's something like Plato, it doesn't matter that they haven't actually gone back and looked at the text maybe for 20 years, or in many cases I've had professors teaching texts that he read never. It doesn't matter that there are vast factual errors in the material they're presenting. So another example from my own life, I had several times professors in Asian studies who were completely omitting India, really the subcontinent of India. They were teaching the history of Asia as if it consisted only of China and Japan on the one hand, and then the West, the interactions with the West. This leads to many, many absurdities in the classroom. But one professor, was seriously presenting his lecture with no irony. He was presenting the history of Asian studies as a discipline, as something that began in Chicago after World War II, and that arose out of the American interaction with Japan. And, again, I'm much more self-confident than the other students in the classroom. Other students, again, if you film this and put it on YouTube, and if you just sat back and watched later, if you scrutinized what your professor was saying later, maybe in relation to what you Google or look up on Wikipedia, maybe even in relation to the assigned readings. You're doing the readings and you're looking back at what that lecture was afterwards. It might occur to you to say what I said, which is, I'm sorry, but this doesn't make sense. Have you heard of Sanskrit? Have you heard of the centuries-long tradition of European scholarship on Sanskrit that is certainly prior to World War II? You know, even if we're limiting this to Jesuit scholars walking to China from Europe. Sorry, I'm saying walking. I shouldn't say walking, but anyway, sorry, going to China by but sometimes by horse and carriage, and sometimes by boat journey and what have you. But going by primitive means China. The contact between Europe and Asia goes back a very long ways. Indeed, the Vatican archives have wonderful manuscripts going back to early interactions between Europeans and the Chinese. And with India, the contact was basically never broken. There's basically never a period of history where Europe did not have contact with India, but partly just due to geography, trade, and what have you. But the same fateful year, 1492. So if you've grown up in the United States, they teach children this rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. As I recall, it's starting in 1490 that you have permanent European colonies on the shores of India. So it's the Portuguese and the Spanish who wrote there first, and then the British and the French race to catch up with them. But the colonization, including really brutal slaughter of civilians, I've read many of those accounts. But I just say, in case you think brutality somehow came much later, no, many of the efforts at colonization began with remarkably pointless slaughter and brutality. The colonization, and then indeed the Asian studies, the studies of the languages and cultures, the intellectual engagement of those people starts, well, to say the least, much, much earlier than World War II. Now, this professor was flabbergasted. He was astonished that somebody would factually challenge him on this claim that Asian studies began in after World War II in Chicago. And, this isn't even Eurocentric. This is Americocentric and Japanocentric. But I say, I'm sorry, do you not know that there are great traditions of sinology, even if we're just talking about China, in Germany, Switzerland, Italy, France, England? Sinology is one thing, the study of China and Japan, sure. But I mean, again, Sanskrit, if you talk about the engagement with India and with Indian literature, you've got manuscripts going back a long, long way. And as it so happens, I have some experience in this field. Now, you can see most professors I've known feel afraid of their students. It's true, some students feel bullied by the professors, but they may underestimate the extent to which the professors feel bullied by the students at all times. And in a situation like this, the reason why it was so difficult, I think, for this professor to accept it's not even a criticism, I'm just pointing out that what he's saying is grossly factually inaccurate, is that I think he'd given the same lecture every year, maybe every second year, for his entire career as a tenured professor. And it had never occurred to him to question this assumption that the timeline began in Chicago after World War II. It's it's patently absurd. Professors who feel afraid of their students. We have an old saying in English that shame is the mother of learning. There's an alternative. And I think that sousveillance coming into the classroom, so i.e. the power of surveillance being in the hands of the students, as soon as they're aware of the possibility that they'll actually be accountable for what they teach, not just for its accuracy, but in a sense it having a positive educational intent attached to it. Like, are you really teaching things in order to benefit the students, or are you just indulging your own eccentricities, your own research interests? Are you bragging or boasting about irrelevant things? I mean, I had one professor who came in. She was a very young professor, and she started the first class by putting her backpack on the table and standing there like a stand-up comedian, and talking about the fact that she was gay, disabled, and Quebecois. and therefore she was a minority within a minority within a minority. And she did this whole like social justice warrior stand-up comedy routine. And this was a serious political science class, and she was using the time that we were paid thousands of dollars to be there for, just talking about herself and her life. And I mean, it wasn't. I just mentioned it wasn't funny. I mean, nobody else laughed or found it enjoyable. But there's this kind of uneasy silence in the whole class. There's a relationship of authority to this professor, and we're there with our books and our notebooks, and it's like, should we be taking notes on this while you talk about what it's like being a disabled lesbian from Quebec? And and it was something like, wasn't today's lesson supposed to be on Plato? It wasn't Plato. It was probably John Stuart Mill, but it was one of the major political philosophers that we were supposed to be covering. Obviously the world would be a better place if professors were positively motivated to help their students, if they cared about education for the sake of education, if they were trying to educate their students just because it was the right thing to do. But bringing sousveillance into the classroom, bringing the possibility of real scrutiny and real accountability into the classroom will transform university level education. I mean, look, it could transform all education. I mean, I know accounts of people. There's one account I read on the internet, a family, they had a disabled child who was in a school that had a special program for the disabled children, and they could just tell from the way their son was shaken up that something was wrong at school, but they didn't know what it was, and because he's mentally disabled, he couldn't really articulate to them what the problem was, and so they just put an audio recorder in his backpack that he didn't know was there, and recorded what the teachers said all day, and this little level of surveillance, and then of course they could put it on the internet and they could take a complaint forward to the school board. They found out right away what the problem was. It certainly is sad to say that the terror professors will feel, the fear of being wrong, the fear of misleading their students, the fear of being inaccurate, the fear of being bad at their jobs is going to be what will motivate a fundamental improvement in modern Western academia. But in some ways, fear gets a bad rep. The professors I've known who felt bullied and who felt afraid of their students, the question I had to ask them, you have to be very delicate and ask this question, is why can't you take this fear and turn it into a positive motivation? Why don't you have the passion to really fact check your own work? I mean, it wouldn't even take more than a Google search to go through your lecture notes and question, wait a minute, why are you saying that Confucianism teaches that men and women are equal, teaches gender equality? It's nothing more than a Google search to fact check that. Have you read the text? Why aren't you going to these lectures feeling a sense of pride that you know your stuff, and feeling a sense of positive mission that you're sharing with the next generation something really meaningful, something they're going to take on board for their careers, or just for the betterment of their own minds and their own sense of moral responsibility on planet Earth. I've known very close to zero professors who had that sense of positive motivation. I could make a separate video talking about the exceptions, the professors who really did have that sense of positive motivation, and who cared about the content of what they were teaching, and who cared about the impact this was going to have on their students. But it's very clear. Look, speaking about every culture I've ever been a part of, or I've ever stuck my toe into, it's obvious that, sorry, to quote one of my own professors, I have one professor who was an anarchist, and something he wrote was simply, authority is real. It's an interesting point, because of course authority is an abstract concept. The effects of authority can be measured and quantified. It's a very sad fact that, in the humble, shabby context of the university classroom, the professor doesn't feel like a tyrant. The professor, if anything, may feel powerless and bullied by his or her own students. And yet, nevertheless, the effect of the authority they have is very real. And we see really every day on university campuses We see a parody of the very virtues that professors are supposed to exemplify. We see them making reckless and irresponsible use of the little bit of the authority they have, in no way to the betterment of their students, and you know, ultimately, I think, leading to their abandoning, the very sense of positive purpose and mission that probably at some stage inspired them to commit their lives to an area of study, to an area of research, to take the first steps that led to them being in that position of authority in the first place. Sousveillance. If a policeman only treats you with courtesy and respect because he knows that he's on camera, it is nevertheless the case that he's treating you with courtesy and respect. If your professors redouble their efforts to know their material and deliver it in a manner that's really meaningful and cogent, if they make that effort only because they know they're on camera and maybe they know examples of their colleagues who've been made fools out of by throwing out false facts, at least they are inspired one way or another to make that effort, to show you that courtesy and respect.